My narcissistic mother sabotaged our adoption to deny us children. Me, 38F, and my husband Dan, 40M, come from very different family backgrounds. Dan's parents, Frank, 65M, and Marie, 62F, are kind, loving people who treated me like their own daughter from the day we met. My parents, however, are a different story entirely. My mother Ellen, 60F, is a narcissistic control freak who has always tried to rule our lives with an iron fist. My father Robert, 63M, is a passive doormat who never stands up to her. From a young age, I learned that disagreeing with my mother's views or decisions would result in punishments ranging from silent treatment to verbal abuse to threats of being disowned. When Dan and I got married 5 years ago, we decided to start trying for children right away. We both wanted a family and looked forward to becoming parents together. Unfortunately, my mother made this an incredibly stressful experience from the beginning. Ellen was obsessed with the idea of being a grandmother and inserted herself into our family planning at every turn. She constantly nagged us about doctor's appointments, fertility treatments, and even our sex life. If I didn't provide constant updates, she would accuse me of shutting her out and not letting her be a part of this journey. After 2 years of trying with no success, we began looking into adoption options. This only made my mother's behavior worse. She attacked me for being selfish and unwilling to give her biological grandchildren. She claimed I was doing this to spite her. The tension came to a head when Dan and I finally decided to move forward with an open adoption plan. My mother was furious that the birth mother would have visitation rights, ranting that her grandchild would be shared with someone else. I put my foot down and told her she wouldn't be involved if she couldn't be supportive. Ellen's retaliation was swift and cruel. While Dan and I were busy with adoption paperwork and home study visits, my mother took it upon herself to contact the adoption agency directly. Posing as me, she filled out a new application stating our preference for a closed adoption only, no contact with the birth mother whatsoever. By the time we realized what had happened, it was too late. The birth mother felt misled and broke off the adoption plan entirely. We were devastated. When I confronted my mother about her deceit, she admitted to everything, claiming she had only been looking out for her grandchild. I was blindsided by my mother's selfish actions and audacity. How could she hijack the most important decision of our lives out of her own entitled desire for control? Dan and I were utterly heartbroken at losing our potential child. We struggled with feelings of anger, betrayal, and profound grief. In that moment, I knew I had to finally cut my mother out of my life completely. Someone so toxic and manipulative had no place in our family. My father dismissively claimed I was overreacting, which only solidified my resolve. For the first time, I stood up to my parents and their abuse. My mother didn't take this well at all. She switched from taunting me about being a barren failure to terror-filled calls about redemption and desperately wanting to be a grandmother. I stood firm, refusing to let her crocodile tears sway me. Ellen then tried to turn other family members against me, claiming Dan and I were being unreasonable for shutting her out during such an emotional time. My siblings thankfully took my side, having witnessed her narcissistic ways for years. This only enraged her further, and she doubled down on her smear campaign. With the adoption avenue closed to us for the time being, Dan and I grieved for several months while exploring other options. In vitro fertilization seemed our best chance at biological children, though it was incredibly expensive with no guarantees. As we anticipated this difficult financial and emotional road ahead, my father approached us with an olive branch from my mother. She apparently felt terrible about her mistake. She didn't, and wanted to make amends by offering us a personal loan to cover IVF costs. I immediately smelled a rat. My suspicions proved correct when we received a letter from my mother's lawyer. Buried in the dense legalese about the loan terms was a noxious grandparents' rights clause. If we accepted her money, we would be contractually obligated to allow her unlimited access and authority over any children we had through IVF. I had never felt so utterly violated. This was just another vile attempt by my mother to seize control over our family. Dan and I promptly lawyered up, pushing back with full force and refusing her loan. We would find another way, without sacrificing our independence or future children's well-being. Unfortunately, Ellen was relentless in her crusade. She launched a social media smear campaign, posting vicious lies that Dan and I were lazy grifters trying to con money from her and other family members for IVF. She claimed we never intended to make her a grandmother if we had kids. This went beyond just her usual toxicity. Ellen was hell-bent on destroying my reputation and any chance we had at adopting or doing IVF successfully. Dan urged me to fight fire with fire and take legal action. At first, I was hesitant to escalate the conflict further. But then my mother crossed an unforgivable line. In her warped determination to become a grandmother at all costs, Ellen took advantage of the only tenuous family connection we had left, Dan's wonderful parents, Frank and Marie. She fed them lies that we were squandering our finances on frivolous purchases instead of IVF, and desperately needed a loan to make our dreams of children a reality. The poor unsuspecting grandparents refinanced their home at retirement age to give us a $50,000 gift for our pseudo-fertility treatments. We were blindsided when they showed up at our doorstep with the check, thinking they were helping make their grandchild dreams come true. I had never felt rage like that moment of realizing my mother had essentially conned Dan's parents out of their life savings for her own selfish agenda. These were the kindest people who only wanted to support us, and my mother unconscionably manipulated their generosity as weapons against us. Dan and I immediately refused the check and came clean with Frank and Marie about Ellen's scheming. They were utterly devastated, both by her cruelty toward us, and her betrayal of their trust. We collectively decided that enough was enough. If Elena wanted to go nuclear, we would fight fire with hotter fire. Our first order of business was filing a restraining order and cease and desist against my mother, barring her from contacting us or spreading more lies online. We sent a firmly worded letter to her lawyer rebuking her attempted grandparents' rights claim as well. Next, we built a robust legal case for defamation, fraud, and emotional damages, all rooted in my mother's callous machinations to disrupt our family planning. The paper trail of her impersonations, manipulation tactics, and illicit loan offer gave us substantial ammunition. Ellen was outraged at being served, but the evidence was insurmountable. My siblings' testimonies also cemented what a lifelong pattern of narcissistic abuse this was. In the end, she had no choice but to settle. The settlement was substantial. Not only did my mother have to pay Dan and me a six-figure sum for damages, but she was also court-ordered to cover the full cost of one cycle of IVF treatment at one of the best fertility clinics in the country. More importantly, she was banned by court order from any ability to claim future grandparents' rights over our children, should we be lucky enough to have them. This was the biggest win, protecting our family from her meddling for good. As for Frank and Marie, we immediately wrote them a check refunding every penny Ellen had swindled, including the refinancing costs. We could never repay their intended kindness, but providing that financial security back was the least we could do. Even with the legal victories and getting Ellen out of our lives for good, the emotional scars ran deep. Dan and I spent over a year in intensive therapy, working through the trauma of my mother's abuse and the grief of our failed adoptions. Rebuilding trust and reclaiming our reproductive autonomy were challenging, frightening journeys. There were so many setbacks, false starts, and heartbreaks along the way with IVF. What kept us going was leaning on each other's strength, shutting out the toxicity, and focusing on creating the loving family we always dreamed of. Against all odds, our third IVF cycle took. We were overjoyed to finally be expecting our miracle twins, a son and daughter born happy and healthy. As our babies grow bigger every day, I still struggle with the resentment toward my mother for all the pain she caused us in our quest to become parents. She may have been cut out of our lives, but her selfish actions left permanent scars. Yet I also feel an immense freedom in breaking that cycle of abuse, raised without Ellen's narcissistic toxicity. My children will never know a grandmother like that, only the pure, unconditional love that Dan's parents shower them with. Our family's journey was the longest, rockiest road to get here, but it only makes us cherish and appreciate the beautiful life we created all the more. If there's one lesson to take from our story, it's that you can survive and overcome even the cruelest forms of betrayal through courage, perseverance, and deciding to have the last laugh. Break story 2. Me, 32F, and my husband, 34M, have been together for 8 years, married for 5. We have 2 kids, a boy, 6, and a girl, 3. My husband works long hours as a software engineer, and I'm a stay-at-home mom. We've had our ups and downs, but overall, our marriage has been pretty solid. My in-laws, however, have been a constant source of stress. My mother-in-law, 60F, and father-in-law, 62M, are incredibly wealthy and have always looked down on me for being from a middle-class family. They've made snide comments about my background, my career choices, and even my appearance over the years. Despite their condescending attitudes, we've always tried to maintain a civil relationship with them, especially for the sake of our kids. My in-laws adore their grandchildren and shower them with expensive gifts and attention whenever they visit. One thing that has always been a point of contention is my mother-in-law's beloved Persian cat, Precious. She treats the cat like it's a human child, and she's always bragging about how expensive and well-bred it is. Whenever we visit, she makes sure to flaunt Precious in front of us, as if to remind us of our inferior status. A few weeks ago, my husband and I were visiting my in-laws for a family dinner. As usual, my mother-in-law spent most of the evening cooing over Precious and showing her off to everyone. At one point, I went to use the bathroom, and as I was walking back down the hallway, I heard a strange noise coming from my in-law's bedroom. Curious, I peeked inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My father-in-law was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Precious was. Well, let's just say she wasn't being treated like a beloved pet. I was horrified and disgusted. I quickly backed away from the door, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind was racing, and I felt sick to my stomach. How could someone do something like that to an innocent animal? I knew I had to tell my husband, but I didn't want to cause a scene in front of my in-laws. So, I waited until we got home that night before breaking the news to him. My husband was understandably shocked and outraged. He couldn't believe that his own father would be capable of such a despicable act. We spent hours discussing what to do, weighing the pros and cons of confronting my in-laws or going straight to the authorities. In the end, we decided to give my father-in-law the benefit of the doubt and confront him first. Maybe there was some sort of misunderstanding or explanation that could make this whole situation a little less horrific. A few days later, we arranged to meet my in-laws for lunch. As soon as we sat down, my husband looked his father square in the eye and asked him if there was anything he wanted to tell us. My father-in-law tried to play dumb at first, but when my husband described what I had seen, the color drained from his face. He didn't deny it or try to make excuses. Instead, he just sat there, silent and ashamed. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, went into full defensive mode. She accused me of making up lies to try and turn her family against each other. She claimed that I was just jealous of their wealth and status, and that I was trying to ruin their reputation out of spite. The situation quickly escalated, with both sides shouting and accusing each other. My husband tried to reason with his parents, but they were both too consumed by anger and denial to listen. Eventually, my husband had had enough. He stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and told his parents that if they couldn't take responsibility for their actions and get help, then we wanted nothing more to do with them. My in-laws were stunned into silence. For once, they didn't have a snide remark or put down to throw away. They just sat there, looking small and defeated. In the weeks that followed, my husband and I struggled with what to do next. We knew that what my father-in-law had done was illegal, but we also didn't want to cause any more drama or stress for our kids. We went back and forth, weighing the pros and cons of pressing charges or just cutting ties with my in-laws altogether. In the end, we decided that we couldn't let something so heinous go unpunished. We gathered all the evidence we could, my eyewitness account, any circumstantial evidence we could find, and took it to the police. They were horrified by what we told them, and they assured us that they would investigate thoroughly. My in-laws, of course, denied everything. They claimed that I was making the whole thing up out of spite, and that I was trying to turn their own son against them. They hired the best lawyers money could buy and vowed to fight the charges tooth and nail. The legal battle that ensued was long and brutal. My in-laws tried every trick in the book to discredit me and my husband, and to cast doubt on our claims. They brought up every perceived slight or disagreement we'd ever had, trying to paint us as vindictive and untrustworthy. It was an emotionally and financially draining ordeal, but we refused to back down. We knew we were in the right, and we were determined to see justice served. After months of court dates, testimonies, and legal wrangling, the verdict finally came down. My father-in-law was found guilty of animal abuse and sentenced to a year in prison, plus a hefty fine. It was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, we were relieved that he was being held accountable for his actions. On the other, it was heartbreaking to see our family torn apart like this, all because of one person's sick and twisted behavior. My in-laws, true to form, refused to take any responsibility or show any remorse. They blamed us for overreacting and ruining their lives. They vowed to appeal the verdict and continue fighting us every step of the way. It was a painful reminder of just how toxic and narcissistic they truly were. They cared more about their own pride and reputation than they did about taking accountability for their actions. In the aftermath of the legal battle, my husband and I were left emotionally drained and scarred. We had to explain to our kids, in age-appropriate terms, why Grandpa wasn't around anymore and why we weren't talking to that side of the family. It was a difficult conversation, and it broke our hearts to see the confusion and sadness in our children's eyes. They didn't understand why their grandparents, who had always showered them with love and gifts, could do something so terrible. Looking back, I know we did the right thing by standing up to my in-laws and holding them accountable. What my father-in-law did was unforgivable, and he deserved to face consequences for his actions. At the same time, The whole ordeal has left scars that may never fully heal. Our once happy family is now fractured, and our kids have had their innocence shattered in a way that no child should ever have to experience. If there's one lesson to be learned from all of this, it's that money and status mean nothing if you don't have basic human decency and compassion. My in-laws may have been wealthy, but they were morally bankrupt, and in the end, that's a debt that can never be repaid.